Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth, presented by Associates for Biblical Research. I'm your host, Henry Smith. On Digging for Truth, we explore the archaeology and lands of the Bible. Now today, archaeologist Titus Kennedy joins us again, as we continue to explore selected archaeological sites throughout Bible lands. Today, we'll be zipping through Anatolia, Greece, and Rome. Okay, Titus, welcome back to Digging for Truth.
Good to be back.
All right, it's good to have you back. Now, last program, Titus, we were talking about your new book, The Essential Archaeological Guide to Bible Lands. We want to refer people back to part one where we covered Mesopotamia, Egypt, and just a wee bit of Persia. But today we want to talk we want to go to the region of Anatolia. Let's tell the audience first, what is that region broadly speaking, and then we're going to delve into the book of Revelation, which I think people will find fascinating.
Sure. Well, Anatolia comes from Greek, a term meaning the east, so it was applied to this area that they considered the east, but it essentially is comprised of Turkey and Armenia today, with a little bit of northern Syria, perhaps. So people can look on their modern maps and understand where that is.
Super. Okay, so let's dive into the book of Revelation. The cities, of course, we have a number of cities identified with letters that are written to these cities. Let's begin with the city of Smyrna. This is really, all of these are fascinating, but I thought it'd be great to cover at least a few of them today. Tell us about Smyrna.
Well, Smyrna is where the modern city of Izmir is. So this is on the coast of Asia Minor, touching the Aegean Sea, or the western coast of Turkey there. And it's a quite old city, probably established around 1000 BC, but then it was rebuilt after the time of Alexander the Great. So what people are looking at today typically is going to be the Greek and Roman period ruins of Smyrna. Of course, that's the time period that we see Smyrna referred to in the Bible, in the book of Revelation there during the first century. It was, again, a port city, quite wealthy and important, seems to have had a large population, maybe around 100,000 people. And in addition to all these factors, it was also a place where we see your typical temples like Zeus and Cybele, the mother goddess, Dionysus, and so forth. But in addition to that, temples dedicated to the Roman emperors, such as Domitian. So that was something that probably factored into the issues with Christians in the first century. The imperial cult seems to have been a big problem.
Yeah, so now in your book, you talk a little bit about what's called the synagogue of Satan. Now, the superficial reading of that would be, sort of Jews that rejected Jesus as the Messiah, no longer are going in the right direction spiritually, that kind of thing. But you give a little bit more nuance to that in your discussion of that. Tell us, I mean, that's always been my superficial reading of that. But tell us a little bit more about your take on that.
Well, based on the makeup of the city, the buildings, the temples that are located there, and how prominent the imperial cult was, I speculated that perhaps the synagogue of Satan referred to Jews who were actually getting mixed up with the imperial cult, because during the time of Domitian, you were essentially forced to participate in the imperial cult to some degree. Of course, some people refused to do that. Probably most of the Christians did, and that got them in trouble, as I said before. But this may have been Jews who were also participating in that imperial cult just so that they wouldn't rock the boat. So they're kind of taking things a step farther.
Yeah, the usual pressures of culture and religiosity and worldview sort of pressuring in on people who are trying to follow their faith, as it were, in this particular case, and mixing it together. But that's very pointed language from the Apostle John. It really draws out for us that syncretism is a really bad idea. That's something that I kind of get out of that. Like, that's when I read your analysis of that, I thought, yeah, there you go. There's the dangers of it. We're kind of afraid to call it something as pointed as the synagogue of Satan, but it really is dangerous for people spiritually to do that. So let's move to city number 2. This is actually the third city addressed in John's letter, and that is the city of Pergamon. Tell us some things about that our audience might be interested in.
Well, Pergamum is one of the most interesting cities to visit, I think, especially of these 7 churches, because of the incredible archaeological remains that we have there. So there's this massive theater located on the edge of a cliff, essentially. Again, it was quite large, around 100,000 inhabitants. It was known for parchment industry, and it also had a large community of Jews there. However, no evidence yet of a synagogue has been found. But Pergamum is the place where this famous altar was discovered. So a lot of people, I think, probably know about this altar to some degree. And it's called either the Pergamon altar. Some people refer to it as the altar of Zeus because it was associated with Zeus, it seems to be, or maybe Zeus and Athena. But it's huge. It's one of the biggest altars in the ancient world. It was about 112 feet by 118 feet. It's U-shaped, about 40 feet high, and it's got all these carvings on it of mythological scenes about the Olympian gods, the giants, and then the founder of the city of Pergamon, Telephus. So it was definitely a very large pagan monument.
Now, you mentioned here that these gods are associated with the serpent, particularly Asclepius and Dionysus. You also mentioned the throne of Satan. We already talked about the synagogue of Satan in Smyrna, but the throne of Satan, give us some more on that. Flesh that out a little bit.
So many people think that the throne of Satan could be referring to this altar that I just described, this Pergamon altar, which I think that's a plausible interpretation. However, I think it could also just be referring to the city itself as the throne of Satan because of how steeped in paganism it was, with all these different temples and gods and this massive altar, in addition to what you just said, this serpent-associated cults of Asclepius and Dionysus. In fact, they had this procession where they would have this sacred serpent in a box. And so they were very, very connected to not just gods associated with serpents, but to the underworld. And it was a very, very pagan city. So it may have been a center of paganism, so to speak. Yes. And in that sense, the throne of Satan is situated in a place like Pergamon.
Yeah, these archaeological discoveries really draw out, and you do this well in your book, like put yourself as a Christian in this background. Like that's kind of like one of the things that I got out of reading some of this material. Like sometimes you forget how deeply they were into this pagan idolatry. Well, Titus, we got to take a break. We'll be right back. We're going to be talking about the island of Patmos next. So don't go away.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm Henry Smith. I'm here today with Dr. Titus Kennedy. Now, we are surveying Dr. Kennedy's new book, The Essential Archaeological Guides to Bible Lands, and we encourage you to pick up a copy of it. It's really edifying, and it just takes you on a great journey throughout all these great places in the Bible. Now, we're going back to Revelation, Titus. We want to talk about the island of Patmos, where the Apostle John was in exile. What do we know about this fascinating place?
Well, we know from the book of Revelation that's where John was when he was receiving the visions and writing the books. But Patmos is this tiny little island west of Turkey and south of Greece. So it's only 13 square miles total. But if you go there or you look at it on a map, you see it's shaped kind of like an hourglass, and it's only 7.5 miles north to south. So you can traverse the island by foot quite quickly. A lot of people wonder, was this just a completely deserted island where they threw John? No, it wasn't. There actually was a city there, or maybe we should call it a town, but it had various structures that you would find in Roman towns and cities, some temples and a stadium, things like that, and a port, of course. But what's very interesting about this island and others like it in the area is that we know from Roman sources that these were used specifically for exiling not just political prisoners, but religious prisoners, including Roman Christians, late in the first century. Even people who had high status, noble families, people like Domitilla and Flavius Clemens. So the fact that John was sent to Patmos is perfectly consistent with the policies and customs of the Roman Empire at that time for Christians and for high profile people who are causing issues in the empire.
Yeah, not surprising. Those of us who have delved into New Testament archaeology, this kind of stuff pops out with historical records all the time. I understand there's a Byzantine church there that commemorates supposedly the location where he received the revelation. What do we know about that?
Well, there's a cave that is traditionally attributed to the cave where John essentially lived on the island, which I think it's plausible. It's difficult for us to say too much about that connection. However, I can comment that the early Byzantine churches built on or adjacent to biblical historical areas, they're almost always correct. So we don't have a lot of reason to doubt it. We just can't say definitively that, oh yeah, that's the place, or that's the cave where John was living. But he was somewhere there on Patmos, and it could have been about where they placed that early church and monastery.
Yeah, Titus, I want to say the Byzantines pumped out churches and monasteries at places where events took place, like you're pumping out books, my friend. I really appreciate it. So now we are going to go back in time in Anatolia, but we are going to rewind 15, 16 centuries, something along that line, and talk about a favorite subject of Bible readers, the Old Testament, the Hittites. We know a lot from archaeology about them. Give us a little bit of what you know.
Well, we know a lot now. We didn't know a lot until the late 19th century, really. In fact, the Hittites, which are mentioned in the Old Testament, they were thought of by many scholars as a completely invented group of people, or at best, some very minor ethnic group. But that changed in the late 19th century when a lot of tablets and inscriptions were deciphered that mentioned these people, the Hittites. And what scholars found out is that the Hittites actually had a massive and powerful kingdom for centuries. And the capital of this kingdom, at its height anyway, was the city of Hattusa, which is located essentially in central Turkey today. And the capital was relocated and built here in the 17th century BC. So we're thinking the end of the patriarchal period in the Bible in Genesis there. But the Hittites were around before that. So now excavations have been going on there since about 1906. They've exposed all sorts of things from palaces to at least 31 temples and some decorative, elaborate gates. So this is quite the large and powerful civilization.
Yeah, good stuff. Now, a couple thoughts on that. One is Of course, the typical, we don't have evidence for X, and then it shows up in the archaeological record later. Lesson for the church: just wait and see what happens. You never know what's going to be uncovered. Tell us a little bit about what we know as we get closer to the biblical relationships. As we get down a little bit further. Any conflicts between Israel and the Hittites and the records, or what do we know about that?
Well, if we go back a bit earlier, initially there's no conflict. So we see the height of the Hittite Empire's power is probably around the 14th century BC, which, as a side note, is also part of the time when we find these suzerain vassal treaties about the 16th to 14th century BC, these Hittite ones that have 7 components. I find that really interesting because it seems to mirror the component structure of the Sinai covenant, kind of suggesting these were put in place at the same time around 1400 BC. But in Joshua, we see the land of the Hittites referenced in Joshua 1:4, and that is north of the land that is delegated to the Israelites. So we know it's talking about this kingdom of the Hittites that was centered at Hattusa. But as you said, later on, there are some conflicts there. This is slightly different. These are the city-states, the Hittite city-states. After that large kingdom breaks up, during the Iron Age, they have city-states with local kings. And we see references like 1 Kings 10:29 referring to some of these Hittite city rulers. And so that is where they start to come into conflict with the Israelites later on, post 1000 BC.
Yeah, it fits very nicely. That reference to the northern border just fits great with the archaeological record and his eyewitness testimony of the book of Joshua. Okay, Titus, well, we're going to take a break, and we will be right back. ABR is excited to announce the publication of Volume 2 from our excavations at Khirbet el-Maqader. The volume details archaeological remains from about 350 BC to the 8th century. This includes a New Testament village that may have been visited by Jesus. Over 400 pages of analysis, photos, and maps. You can pick up a copy today by visiting BibleArchaeology.org. Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm Henry Smith. I'm here with Dr. Titus Kennedy, archaeologist, friend of the ABR ministry, and also author of the book, The Essential Archaeological Guide to Bible Lands, which we are surveying together in these last 2 episodes. Okay, Titus, wanted to talk about, we've been talking about Anatolia. We've covered quite a range. We did the book of Revelation, we did the Hittites. Now we're even going to go back further in time because this is the region of Ararat. And that's, of course, mentioned where the ark lands in the book of Genesis after the flood. Let's talk about it.
Well, this Ararat name is quite ancient. We don't know how far it goes back, but we can definitively say it's connected to the kingdom of Urartu. So they're talking about a region centered around Ararat, and actually Mount Ararat is smack in the middle of that kingdom of Urartu area from ancient times. Some people think the name is even connected to the Sumerian writing called Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata, but it's a little more speculative. Anyhow, as you said, Noah lands on Ararat, and then we have some very interesting things that are discovered around there. For example, on the eastern slopes of Ararat at what's called Areni Cave 1, they found the oldest known wine production facility anywhere. I find this somewhat humorous because we read in Genesis that after Noah gets off the boat, he goes and he plants a vineyard and then he makes wine and he gets drunk. So I can't say that this was Noah's wine production facility, but we do at least see a very early use and production of wine there. We've also got another incredibly early civilization in this area called the Kura Araxes culture. And one of the center points for that, one of the biggest cities, and actually one that was discovered first, is called Shengavi. This is in present-day Yerevan, the capital of Armenia. It's on what's called Lake Yerevan, but it was a river before they made it into a lake. And this is a large walled city. We don't know if we could call it the capital of the Kura-Araxes culture, but it's certainly one of the centers. And this culture goes back maybe as far as 3000 BC, kind of hard to pin because of the lack of textual material. But it does seem to be another one of these situations where after early civilization in southern Mesopotamia at places like Uruk, we have something called the Uruk expansion. We've got the Table of Nations that seems to be very, very similar to that. And then just after this period, we have the establishment of this massive culture, the Kura-Araxes culture up there.
Yeah, excellent. There's a lot of old stuff around that region, and it's really fascinating. It's just enough to point us in the direction of the narrative. Of course, generally speaking, of course, we haven't found the Ark, so that would be, of course, the greatest discovery of all time. In your book, you don't say that the Ark has been found or where it is, but you give this context, and I think it's very helpful for readers. We encourage them to explore it further. Okay, Titus, now we are going to jump back forward in time, back into the New Testament. We're kind of going back and forth here. One of the subjects you wanted to emphasize, and really one of my own personal favorites, is Paul's encounter with the philosophers in Athens. Of course, we have a classic apologetics text there, but we know more about that than just what's there in the text. Let's talk about it.
Well, Paul addresses this council of the Areopagus. So the Areopagus is quite well known from ancient sources. Of course, people probably know where the hill of the Areopagus was, but there are also buildings that are connected to the council. And that's just northwest of and basically adjacent to the Acropolis in Athens. Now, this name, Areopagus, is derived either from the god Ares or possibly from these female spirits of curses. Okay, so we're not exactly sure the etymology, but it could be one of those. But what I think is very important here is that in the classical period, the Council of the Areopagus became a place for judicial tribunals to investigate major crimes like homicide, murder, and corruption. And then it was developed also into investigating blasphemy, essentially weird or strange religious beliefs. In fact, Socrates was tried by the Council of Areopagus because of introducing strange deities, and he was imprisoned at this prison next to it, and he was forced to take poison and die. So we see some precursors to this whole questioning the new religious beliefs that come about. We also see that later on in the Roman period. So when Paul gets there and he is talking about Jesus Christ and the resurrection, the Areopagus still has this duty to investigate strange religious ideas. Now, they don't have the power to condemn anyone to death anymore. That's in the hands of the Roman officials. But they do interrogate him there, either on the hill or maybe in the painted stoa, which was the gathering place of Zeno's followers, or maybe somewhere where like the royal stoa next by. We're not quite sure of the exact location.
Yes, very consistent with the biblical background, the biblical text, right? The background and all that. Well, Titus, believe it or not, we have run out of time. We've run out of airstrip, my friend. But thank you so much for writing this book. I think our audience is going to love it. Appreciate your faithfulness to the Word, the pursuit of academic excellence, and our partnership together. Really means a lot to me and the ministry of ABR. We're grateful for you, man.
Thank you, Henry. I appreciate you, and thanks for having me on the show.
All right, we're looking forward to having you back on once again. Well, friends, thank you for joining us. We do hope you pick up a copy of Dr. Kennedy's book, but taking from it even something greater, and that is the reliability of the story of Scripture. What we see recorded in the Bible, we can trust it's accurate. And what's most important about that is the track of Scripture in the Old Testament all the way through to the gospel of Jesus, that these events are recorded in history, and Jesus is the fulfillment and the culmination of that history and the working of God in that history. We thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth.
Digging for Truth is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different.